Do you remember the precise sound of a city's heart racing in the dark, when every siren is a question, every distant boom a threat, and strangers press so close you can feel their fear trembling through your own bones? They called it the Blitz spirit, as if courage was simply another ration doled out nightly. But for Elias Abernathy, a young American far from home, London's midnight air raids felt less like spirit and more like survival. Raw, sharp, and heavy, with the unspoken promise that nothing would ever be the same again. On this particular evening in early 1942, the city seemed to hold its breath. Fog and smoke mingled above the Thames, masking the moon and muting the shouts of air raid wardens. Eli hurried along the curb, the soles of his boots slapping wet pavement. The distant drone of engines, enemy or friendly, who could tell anymore, echoed between the sandbagged entrances of boarded-up shops. His knuckles were white around the handle of a battered satchel, which held, in addition to blueprints and letters from home, a single bar of chocolate and a ration book edged in thumb creases. He was not a soldier, not even British. He was here because the war needed hands and minds, and apparently mechanical engineers who could make broken things work again. Boston was a world away, and with every blackout night felt further still. A warden's whistle shrilled, "Shelter, all down to the shelter!" The crowd thickened as people ducked under the arches of the stone stairwell, moving with the practiced panic of those who had done this dozens of times before. Eli shuffled forward with the others, the collar of his worn grey coat turned up against the damp. He avoided eye contact, careful not to seem too American, too out of place. It was a lesson he'd learned after his first week. Blend in, keep your head down, and for God's sake don't ask for directions. The shelter was an old tube station, tiles cracked and stained, the air tinged with metal and sweat, and the faint sweet smell of overripe fruit from a basket someone had set by the wall. Flickering bulbs cast shadows over the crowd, mothers cradling infants, old men wrapped in scarves, children clutching battered toys. A girl in a Red Cross armband passed out blankets, her hands moving briskly, face set in determined lines. Eli found a spot against the wall, wedged between a portly man reading a copy of the Times and a young woman clutching a violin case. He tried to look occupied, unspooling a letter from his mother but not really reading it, just tracing the familiar loops of her handwriting, pretending that Boston's calm streets and his old life were only a train ride away. A sudden shift in the crowd caught his attention. Someone squeezed in beside him. A woman, her coat patched at the elbows, hair tucked beneath a drab knitted hat. She smelled faintly of lavender and newspaper ink, a sharp, incongruous scent in the stale air. She glanced at him, her eyes quick and bright, then away, as if measuring the risk of conversation. "Excuse-moi," she murmured, accent soft and unmistakably French, as she adjusted the battered satchel on her lap. Her hands were slender, ink-stained. She held a crumpled letter, its edges worn from too many readings. Eli hesitated, then replied, "No problem. Plenty of room, I suppose." His Boston vowels sounded jarringly foreign in his own ears. For a moment they sat in silence, the only sounds the low hum of nervous chatter and the distant rhythmic thumping that everyone tried to pretend was thunder, not bombs. The woman shifted, her coat brushing his arm. He caught a glimpse of her profile, cheekbones sharp, mouth set in a line that spoke of fatigue and stubbornness in equal measure. The lights flickered, dimmed. Somewhere down the platform a child whimpered. The thud of another explosion, closer this time, sent a ripple through the shelter. Eli's heart pounded. The woman beside him let out a slow, controlled breath and tucked her letter away. "First time?" she asked, voice just above a whisper. He shook his head, managed a wry smile. "Second week. I'm still learning when to duck," she laughed, a dry, brittle sound. "You will learn quickly. London teaches fast." He looked at her hands, the ink stains, the way she clutched her satchel as if it held everything that mattered. "You're not from here either." Her gaze flicked to his face, sharp and assessing. "No, I am Marguerite, Margot for short, from Lyon, or I was." Her English was careful, precise. Beneath it, Eli could hear the strain of someone who'd had to learn the language too quickly, for reasons she'd never wanted. He nodded, unsure what to say. "I'm Elias, Eli, Boston." He offered his hand awkwardly. She hesitated, then took it, her grip warm and unexpectedly strong. "It is strange, yes, to be so far from home, and yet, here we are." "Yeah, never thought I'd end up in a London tube station, if I'm honest." Margot smiled, but her eyes looked tired, haunted. She glanced at her satchel, then back at him. "We all end up in places we do not expect. The war decides." The lights flickered again, and for a heartbeat the platform was plunged into darkness. Eli listened to the uneven breathing of those around them, the rustle of blankets, the tentative return of hushed voices when the bulbs buzzed back to life. He became acutely aware of the thinness of the wall behind them, the weight of earth and city above, and the fragile thread of safety that held them all together. Margot shifted, pulling her coat tighter. "Do you have family? In America?" "Yeah, my mother. She writes every week, tells me about the garden, the neighbors, the weather. Like things haven't changed." He realized he was rambling, stopped himself. "What about you?" She hesitated, eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance. "My family is in France. I do not know where now. Letters do not come." Her voice was flat, brittle. Eli felt a surge of helplessness. What comfort could he offer, trapped here with her, both their lives suspended by the war's whims? He opened his mouth, searching for words, but Margot shook her head, a curt, dismissive gesture. "It is all right. You do not have to say anything." He nodded, grateful. The shelter had settled into a restless quiet. Somewhere a harmonica played a thin, wavering tune. Eli studied Margot out of the corner of his eye. She was younger than he'd first thought, early 20s like him, but there was something older in the way she held herself, as if the war had pressed years into her bones. Her hands never stilled. She fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve, smoothed imaginary creases from her skirt, fingers always in motion. Eli wondered if she was cold or simply restless, unable to sit still for fear of what might come next. The air outside reverberated with another distant boom. Margot flinched, then caught herself, straightening her shoulders. "You work in the factories?" she asked, voice steadier now. "Sort of. I'm an engineer. They needed people to keep the machines running, so here I am." She nodded. "The machines, they are important. Everything is important now, even the smallest things." Her accent thickened, words tumbling out. "I translate for a newspaper, underground mostly. It is not much, but—" She shrugged, as if the rest didn't matter. Eli wanted to ask more, but something in her expression warned him off. Instead, he offered, "If you ever need help with, I don't know, fixing things, I'm handy." Margot's lips twitched. "A useful skill. Perhaps I will ask." A pause stretched between them, filled with the chatter of strangers sharing cigarettes and stories. The soft rustle of ration cards, the quiet solidarity of those united not by choice, but by necessity. Eli closed his eyes, listening to the sounds of a city holding itself together. The war had made allies of everyone, even two foreigners on a London platform. The all clear sounded at last, a wavering siren, rising above the city's sigh of relief. The crowd stirred, gathering belongings with the efficiency of people who knew they'd do this all over again tomorrow. Eli stood, stretching stiff muscles, and glanced at Margot. She was already on her feet, smoothing her coat, shouldering her satchel. For a moment their eyes met, a flicker of recognition, of shared experience. She offered a brief nod, then merged into the shifting crowd, her figure swallowed by the press of bodies. Eli hesitated, watching her go. The platform emptied quickly, footsteps echoing up the tiled stairs. Outside, the city glistened with rain and broken glass, the air sharp with the promise of another uncertain day. He lingered at the bottom of the stairs, searching for a glimpse of her in the grey dawn, heart thudding with a strange, unexpected longing. Had he imagined the connection, the spark of understanding? Or had the war simply made everyone desperate for a little warmth, a little kindness? As the last stragglers filed out, Eli felt a sudden, irrational urge to follow, to ask her name again, to make sure she was real. But the city was already moving on, and he was just another face in the crowd. He stepped into the morning chill, breath steaming in the air, the distant bells of St. Paul's tolling the hour. Above him, a patch of sky threatened rain. He checked his watch, adjusted his satchel, and told himself it was nothing. A fleeting moment, a stranger's kindness in the dark. But as he made his way through the battered streets, Eli found himself scanning every face, listening for a French accent in the din, wondering if fate or war would let their paths cross again. 2 weeks had passed since that singular night in the shelter, but the city's pulse, restless, battered, resilient, still thudded through Eli's days. London moved in fits and starts, dreams stitched together by the threadbare routines of war. Every morning, Eli joined the tide of workers spilling from the underground, his battered satchel clutched close, collar turned up against the half-hearted drizzle that never seemed to let go of the city. The echoes of the air raid lingered, but more so did the memory of Margot Dubois. The precise way she had held her crumpled letter, the deliberate calm she wrapped herself in, her French-accented English soft, yet edged with steel. Eli had not seen her since the shelter, but in the crowded city of 3 million he found himself scanning faces in queues and on trams, searching for a flash of copper-brown hair or the stubborn set of her jaw. It was in the canteen at the engineering works, a converted warehouse bristling with pipes and the ceaseless clatter of lunch trays, that he saw her next. She stood at the end of the line, a battered satchel over her shoulder, coat too thin for the unyielding chill. Her eyes flicked over the ration board, lips moving as she counted stamps. He hesitated, uncertain, but the longing to bridge that distance propelled him forward. "Miss Dubois?" he ventured, voice barely audible above the din. She turned, recognition sparking in her eyes. "Monsieur Abernathy," she replied, a flicker of a smile ghosting her lips. "You survived another week. Wasn't sure I would." He tried to joke, but it came out too earnest. "You're working here now?" "Only today. Translating for the foreman. He's got a new team from Belgium." She shrugged, but her voice carried pride. "They need someone to explain which pipe not to touch. I'd rather not see anyone else electrocuted this month." He grinned, relief and something warmer unfurling in his chest. "Mind if I join you?" They sat together, squeezed onto a bench between 2 women in overalls, arguing about jam rations, and a boy fidgeting with a cigarette he had no intention of lighting. Margot's hands were restless, folding and unfolding a scrap of newspaper. "Do you miss it?" she asked, nodding to his accent. "Home?" He thought of the neat brick house in Boston, the safe, predictable streets, his mother's soft voice in every letter. Sometimes, mostly at night when the sirens start. Margot nodded, her gaze fixed on her chipped mug. "You get used to it, or you learn not to listen too closely." A silence settled, not uncomfortable but heavy with words unsaid. After lunch, they parted outside the factory gates. The late sun caught in Margot's hair as she disappeared into the crowd, and Eli felt the ache of her absence, as if he'd misplaced something essential. Over the next month, their paths crossed more often. At the Victory Garden behind St. B. Mary's, both of them muddy-kneed and laughing as they unearthed a pathetic row of potatoes. In the ration queue, where Margot brooded over her dwindling sugar coupons, and Eli offered her half his share. At the offices of the underground newspaper, where Margot delivered translations and Eli lingered, feigning interest in the latest coded crossword. Each meeting felt accidental, yet inevitable. Slowly the city's edges softened. They shared stories over weak tea in crowded boarding houses, or on long walks along the Thames, the water black and moonlit, their footsteps echoing between bombed-out buildings. Margot spoke of Lyon, her father's bakery, the taste of warm brioche, her brother's stubborn pride. She never mentioned the letter Eli had seen in the shelter, but sometimes her words would falter, and her eyes would stray toward the river, as if searching for something she had left behind. Eli in turn told her of Boston, the winter snow, the Red Sox, his mother's garden. He described the city in fragments, always circling around the loss of his father to pneumonia the year before, his mother's loneliness, the pressure in her letters to come home and fill the empty spaces. One evening, after a particularly long shift, Margot appeared at his boarding house, face pale, hands trembling. She pressed an envelope into his hands, a telegram, edges worn from folding and unfolding. "From Lyon," she whispered. "No word from my family. The Red Cross says the city was bombed again last week." He didn't know what to say. He wanted to promise her it would be all right, but the war had stripped such promises of meaning. Instead, he poured her tea, set the battered radio to BBC, and sat beside her in silence until the room darkened and the city's sirens began to wail. When she finally left, her fingers lingered on his for a beat too long, and he felt the tremor run through her. The city pressed on. Each day brought new headlines, new rumors, new reminders of the world's uncertainty. Margot buried herself in translation work, her French and English equally sharp, her laughter rarer. Eli threw himself into engineering, fixing machines meant for a war he only half understood, his mind drifting back to her in quiet moments. One afternoon, as he waited in the post office queue, a letter arrived from Boston, the familiar slant of his mother's handwriting stirring a knot of guilt. Inside, her words pleaded for his return. Her health was failing. The city felt emptier than ever. She longed for him to come home when the fighting stopped. Eli read the letter twice, then tucked it away, heart pounding with the weight of duty and longing. Their next meeting was in the newspaper office's dingy back room, where the smell of ink and onions lingered. Margot was hunched over a typewriter, brow furrowed, translating a coded message from the French resistance. "They blew up a train outside Dijon," she said quietly, not looking up. "No word yet on casualties." He knelt beside her, his hand covering hers. "You'll hear from them. You will." She blinked back tears, straightened her shoulders. "Hope is a dangerous habit, Eli." He squeezed her hand, searching for the right words. "So is giving up." They sat in silence, the clack of typewriter keys and distant rumble of trams filling the air. For every moment of closeness, there seemed to be another that pulled them apart. Letters unanswered, news from home, the ever-present threat that tomorrow might change everything. As the months dragged on, obstacles multiplied. Margot's attempts to trace her family through the Red Cross led only to dead ends. Eli's mother's condition worsened, updates growing more urgent, her handwriting frailer with each letter. The war's machinery ground on, indifferent to individual hearts. A late spring morning found them in a park near Waterloo, sitting on a bench beneath a tree trying valiantly to bloom, despite the soot and cold. Margot handed Eli a slip of paper, her hand shaking. "The consulate says I might return to France. Lion is free now. They're letting some of us back if we can prove we have family alive." Relief and dread twisted through Eli. "You'll go?" "I have to try. If they're there, I must find them, and if not—" She trailed off, her voice raw. "I cannot stay here, waiting for news that never comes." He nodded, unable to trust his voice. She looked at him then, eyes searching. "And you, when the war is over, will you go back to Boston?" He hesitated, thinking of his mother's letters, the promise he'd made to look after her, the city that had never quite felt like home since his father died. I don't know yet." Margot smiled, sad and knowing. "The war makes fools of us all. We pretend we are only passing time, only surviving, but it steals our choices too." He reached for her hand, fingers weaving through hers. For a moment, the noise of the city faded, and all that remained was the warmth between them. But reality intruded, as it always did. That afternoon, a transfer notice arrived at the engineering works. Eli was to report to the American embassy in 2 weeks, his assignment in London ending as the Allies pushed toward victory in France. He would be sent back to Boston as soon as his replacement arrived. He found Margot that evening, standing by the Thames, the river reflecting the city's broken lights. She didn't ask why he looked so pale. Instead, she handed him a slip of paper, a pressed violet, faded but stubbornly beautiful. "For memory," she said simply. He wanted to tell her 1,000 things, that he'd wait for her, that he'd find a way for them to be together, that what they had was more than a wartime dalliance. But the words caught in his throat, tangled in the uncertainty of the world they inhabited. The days grew shorter. Each morning, Eli woke with a sense of impending loss, watching Margot move through the city as if she were already half gone. They clung to small rituals. Tea in the garden, walks along the bombed streets, the comfort of shared silence. But the question lingered. When the war ended, would what they shared survive peace, or was it only a fragile bloom nurtured by the darkness? As the last of the rationed butter melted on their toast one morning, Margot met his eyes, her voice barely above a whisper. "They called it a fling, you know, everyone in the shelter. They all said we were only holding on to each other because we were afraid." He took her hand, squeezed it gently. "Are you afraid?" She smiled, bittersweet, terrified. He laughed, the sound breaking the tension like sunlight through clouds. "Me too." Outside, the city rumbled on. Sirens, trams, the distant promise of an ending. Their days together were numbered, and neither knew what the future would bring. But for now, in the battered heart of London, two strangers held tight to hope, and to each other. If you found yourself drawn into Eli and Margot's story, wondering what choices they'll make as the world changes around them, don't miss what comes next. Subscribe to our channel to follow their journey and discover more unforgettable stories of love, loss, and hope in the shadow of war. The train station was a chaos of collisions, of bodies, of hopes, of goodbyes. The marble floor echoed with the shuffle of boots and the clatter of cases, and beneath the grand clock, the air shimmered with the tension of 1,000 possible futures. Eli Abernathy stood at the edge of the platform, his fingers knotted around the handle of his battered satchel, his eyes searching the shifting crowd for a single familiar silhouette. Every few minutes, a whistle screamed. Every few minutes, someone wept. The war was ending, and with it, the strange, narrow life they'd built in the battered city of London, a life held together by blackout curtains and whispered promises in the dark. But Margot was not there. He checked the time. Again. His transfer papers folded and refolded until the creases had worn thin, burned in his pocket. The newsprint ink from the letter she'd sent him 2 nights ago still stained his thumb. "Meet me by the King's Cross clock," she'd written, in that careful script that was half French, half dream. "If the world is ending, I want to see you at least one more time." Now, as the train to Liverpool rattled in, Eli's certainty wavered. He'd always been methodical. He'd built engines for bombers, mapped out supply routes, kept his life tucked into neat compartments. But Margot had always been the unpredictable variable, the wild card in his careful hand. He scanned the crowd again. Soldiers in olive drab, a mother clutching a boy's hand, porters wheeling crates of Red Cross parcels. For a moment he wondered if Margot had already left for France, swept away by the first wave of liberation, desperate to find news of her family. Or perhaps she'd recoiled from their awkward, impossible goodbye. Perhaps their love had always been a borrowed thing, doomed to be returned when peace came due. His heart hammered. He tried to summon logic, to reason through the ache in his chest. She knows the time, she promised, A tap on his shoulder, light but certain. He turned. There she was, Margot in her faded blue coat, a knitted scarf wound twice around her throat, her hair escaping from beneath a borrowed hat. Her eyes, grey, restless, alive, fixed on his face with a complex mixture of relief and terror. "You almost missed your train," she said, voice unsteady. He tried to smile, but the effort made his jaw ache. "I almost missed you." They stood there, the world rushing and splitting around them, 2 islands in a flood. For a moment, neither spoke. Overhead, the clock ticked, loud, inexorable. Margot's hands were cold when he took them in his. "I have to go," she said softly. "The embassy arranged a seat. Tomorrow I cross to Calais. They need translators, and I need to see if my parents, if anyone—" Her words trailed off, unsaid things thickening the air between them. Eli squeezed her fingers, desperate to memorize their feel. "And I have to go home, my mother. She keeps writing, she needs me, the war—" He shook his head, unable to finish. The silence between them was heavier than any shelling. It was the silence of things ending, of a story forced to close before it had even learned how to begin. "You know," Margot said, her voice trembling with something like laughter, "they all call it a fling. Americans and French, everyone says, don't trust what happens in wartime. It's only because you're scared, because you're lonely." He looked at her. "Are you?" "I'm terrified," she admitted. He wanted to say all the things he'd practiced in the dark. "You are not a fling. You are the only thing that makes this war make sense. I can't imagine a morning without you." But the words stuck, too large for his tongue. Instead, he touched the edge of her scarf, memorizing its color. The loudspeaker crackled. "Final boarding, Liverpool line." Margot's breath caught. "You'll write." "Every day," he promised, voice rough. She nodded, but he saw the doubt flicker behind her eyes. Letters vanish. Borders close. Promises, even the truest ones, can be lost in the machinery of peace. "I wish I could come with you," she whispered, so low he barely heard. He closed his eyes. "I wish I could stay." They leaned into each other, desperate, as if the right embrace might suspend time. But time was merciless. He pressed his lips to her forehead. "Margot." "Whatever happens." She caught his wrist, fierce. "Don't say goodbye." "Not yet." He hesitated, then nodded. He would not say it. He would not let the word come between them. A whistle blew. The train doors began to close. He forced himself to step back, fingers slipping from hers one by one. The crowd surged, and suddenly he was moving, swept onto the train, his face pressed to the window. Margot stood on the platform, hand raised, her breath fogging in the cold air. The train pulled away. He watched until she was only a blur. The city faded into fields, and then into the grey, uncertain distance. In his pocket, her last letter, a scrap of hope, a tether. Spring 1945. Boston. The war was over, but the world did not simply right itself. Eli moved through his mother's narrow apartment with the strange unsteadiness of a man living inside a photograph, a world familiar but suddenly two-dimensional. The streets outside rang with parades and laughter, and yet for him every celebration seemed a little hollow, an echo of an unfinished symphony. He worked long hours at the factory, repairing the machines that had outlasted the war. He wrote to Margot almost every day, his words careful and hopeful, even as the weeks stretched without reply. Her last letter, sent from the ruins of Lyon, was brief and raw. "I am safe. My parents' house is gone. I will look for them. I think of you when I see the morning sun." He read it nightly, the paper growing soft at the creases. Each morning, he checked the post. Each evening he rehearsed what he'd say if the phone ever rang with her voice on the line. He considered the impossibility of crossing an ocean, of visas and quotas and bureaucratic walls, of the ways a single war could fracture 1,000 possible futures. His mother watched him with the wary tenderness of someone who'd lost too much already. "You loved her," she said once, as she poured coffee into his chipped mug. "Don't let the world tell you that was a small thing." He wanted to believe her, but the world seemed determined to make him forget. Friends married sweethearts, started families, moved on. He remained, a man haunted by the color of a scarf and the echo of a promise. One morning, as the first snow fell, he received a letter with no return address. Eli. "They say Lyon will never be the same, but I find myself searching for the places I once knew. I am safe. I have a job at a new paper. Nothing grand, but it keeps me busy. I dream of crossing the sea. I dream of you. Yours, Margot." He let out a sound that was half laughter, half sob. He read the letter until the words blurred. He wrote back, long, rambling pages, telling her about the factory, about his mother's garden, about the way the city looked in the snow. He told her finally the thing he'd never dared before. "I don't care if they call it a fling. I love you. If you can find a way, if there's any chance, come." Weeks passed, spring came. The world rebuilt itself. Still, no answer. Summer. The heat lay on Boston like a fever. Eli's shirt clung to his back as he moved through the train station, this time arriving, not departing. He was not expecting anything, not anymore. He was there to meet a friend's brother, returned from the Pacific, to shake his hand and say, "Welcome home." He cut through the crowd, head down. The station was the same as it had always been. The smell of coal dust, the echo of announcements, the trembling sense of possibility. He was almost to the exit when someone grabbed his sleeve. He turned. For a moment he thought he was dreaming. Margot stood in front of him, thinner than he remembered, her coat too large, a battered suitcase at her feet. Her hair was shorter, her eyes older, but the look in them, hopeful, defiant, terrified, was unchanged. She swallowed. "I wasn't sure you'd be here." He reached for her, almost afraid to touch her, afraid she might vanish. "How?" he managed. She smiled, and it was the bravest thing he'd ever seen. "The embassy. Your letters. I had to see if this was real, if I... He pulled her into his arms. Around them, the world blurred and brightened. He pressed his cheek to her hair, breathing in the scent of travel and rain and hope. "Is this enough?" she whispered. He drew back, looked at her, really looked. "It's everything." They stood there, uncertain, trembling, as if the ground might give way. He took her hand, her fingers strong and sure in his. "I don't know what happens next," she said. He shook his head. "Neither do I. But we're here." And in that moment, every fear, every loss, every night spent listening to the sirens and the silence, none of it mattered. The world had changed, yes, but so had they. The war had given them 1,000 reasons to let go, and yet, here they were, still holding on. He did not say goodbye. He whispered her name and she smiled, and together they stepped into the morning, the city waking around them, the future unwritten, but, at last, shared. The payout, the truth that Eli had feared and Margot had dared to hope, that theirs was not just a fling born of war, but a love strong enough to survive its ending settled between them, quiet and certain, as real as the hand he would hold for 65 more years. On a morning in early autumn, just months after the world had exhaled in relief and the war's final echoes faded into rebuilding, Eli Abernathy stood by the rail of an outbound ship. The Atlantic was grey and endless, churning with the same restless energy that had propelled him from Boston to London years before. But now the journey was reversed, and the future on the far shore felt as uncertain as any blackout night. In his coat pocket he clutched 2 letters, one from his mother, anxiously awaiting his return, and another, creased, ink-smudged, and read 100 times, from Margot. He remembered their last day in London as if it were pressed beneath glass, the city already shifting out of war's shadow, the air thick with exhausted celebration. In the little park by the Thames, where the grass had grown thin from years of boots and worry, Margot's hands trembled when she gave him her address, scribbled on a slip of French ration paper. "We survived so much," she'd whispered, voice unsteady. "But I'm afraid I'll lose you to peacetime." They'd laughed, and then neither of them had laughed at all. Now, home in Boston, Eli felt like a foreigner in his own skin. The city was bustling. Flags in windows, bands playing in the square, returning GIs swept up by parades and sweethearts. But the streets felt too wide, the language too quick, the food too plentiful. Even his mother, fragile and hopeful, seemed to sense the distance in his gaze when he sat at the breakfast table, hands wrapped around a chipped mug, remembering Margot's stories and the way she'd taught him to say "je t'aime" in the quiet after an air raid. Letters crossed the Atlantic, sometimes lost for months in the confusion of post-war mail. Margot wrote of Lyon, her family found but changed, her father gaunt, her mother's laughter quieter. She wrote of the city's scars and how she volunteered at a school for orphans, teaching English to children with haunted eyes. Eli replied with stories of Boston's old neighborhoods, of his mother's garden, of the city's stubborn hope. Every page was a lifeline, but each letter also carried the ache of uncertainty. Visa applications stalled, bureaucratic wires tangled, the world was busy mending, and love was left to fend for itself in the shuffle of passports and policies. As autumn bled into winter, doubt crept in. Friends, some gentle, some not, reminded Eli that wartime love often faded with the gunfire, that people changed, that distance was a crueler adversary than any uniformed enemy. His mother, though she never said it outright, hoped he'd meet a local girl, settle, find normal again. Some nights Eli almost convinced himself to let go, but then Margot's next letter would arrive. In her careful, looping script, she described the taste of chestnuts roasted on lions' corners, her students' laughter, her longing to see the Charles River she'd only glimpsed in his stories. She ended each letter the same way. "Je t'attends. I wait for you." The world, so recently shattered, rearranged itself day by day. News came that travel restrictions were easing. A friend in the French consulate whispered about a new quota for fiancés and spouses, an opportunity if one acted quickly and was willing to prove their intent. Eli read the notice 3 times, heart pounding. He wrote to Margot, "Would you come? I promise you nothing but the uncertainty of a new life and my hand in yours." Her reply took 6 weeks, delayed by snow and strikes and some cosmic test of patience. But when it arrived, the answer was a single line, in English and French both. "Yes, I will come. I will always come to you." The next months blurred in a rush of paperwork, affidavits, interviews at consulates, telegrams, and prayers. Eli's mother wept with a mixture of relief and anxiety. Her son was choosing a future she could barely imagine, with a woman she had only met in faded photos and delicate, accented phone calls. The day Margot arrived at Boston's South Station, the city was silvered with rain. Eli stood at the platform's edge, scanning the crowd. For a moment he feared he wouldn't recognize her. War and worry can change a person, even across mere months. But then he saw her. Thinner, yes, the shadows of the past still in her eyes, but with that same stubborn hope in the curve of her smile. She carried a single suitcase and wore a navy coat, its hem mended in 3 places. He stepped forward, heart thundering. Margot hesitated, then rushed into his arms, and the world seemed to narrow to the warm press of her cheek against his chest. They walked the city's old streets together, Margot marveling at the unfamiliar rhythm of American life. The clamor of streetcars, the riot of color in the markets, the way people rushed and lingered all at once. She met Eli's mother in the small house with the patchwork garden, where laughter and awkwardness mingled in equal measure over Sunday dinners. The transition was not seamless. There were misunderstandings, moments of loneliness, days when the enormity of what they'd left behind threatened to swallow them both. But slowly, a new life took shape. Margot found work teaching French to school children and translating letters for other refugees. Eli returned to engineering, his hands steady again on blueprints and tools. They learned to celebrate small victories. A letter from France bearing good news. A successful recipe for croissants in a stubborn American oven. The first time Margot's laughter filled their kitchen, unguarded and bright. Their love, once forged in the crucible of war, was tested by quieter battles. Homesickness, the struggle to fit 2 worlds into one narrow apartment. The ache for family left oceans away. But each morning they found themselves reaching for one another. Eli's hand on Margot's in the soft blue light before sunrise, a silent promise renewed. Years passed. The scars of the war faded, but never vanished entirely. Margot's parents visited, bewildered by America's pace but grateful their daughter had found a harbor. Eli's mother grew frail, but lived long enough to see the garden bloom with new colors and to call Margot my own. Children came, first a daughter with Eli's quiet eyes, then a son with Margot's stubborn grin. The rhythms of life shifted, school drop-offs, birthday cakes, summer picnics by the river. Yet, through it all, Eli and Margot remained each other's anchor. They spoke French and English in equal measure, their home a tapestry of memories and customs stitched together by love and persistence. 65 years later, sunlight spills across a breakfast nook in a modest house just outside Boston. The world outside is quieter, but within the walls are papered with photographs. Black and white images of 2 young people in wartime London, a wedding in a borrowed suit and hand-sewn dress, children laughing beneath autumn trees, grandchildren with faces bright and new. At the table, Margot and Eli sit as they have every morning for decades, hands clasped, coffee cooling beside them, the silence between them easy and full. The ache of the past is still there, a quiet harmony beneath the melody of their shared years. Sometimes Eli will turn to Margot and whisper, "They called it a fling in wartime." She always answers, "But we are still here, mon amour." Their story is not about grand gestures or flawless happiness. It is a story of choosing again and again to reach across uncertainty and difference, to hold fast through storms and silence, to build a life from hope and stubbornness, and the belief that love, real love, can outlast even the longest night. Perhaps you too have wondered if the connections forged in difficult times can survive the peace that follows. Maybe you've faced your own crossroads, wavered between holding on and letting go, questioned whether love is strong enough to endure change, distance, or doubt. Eli and Margot would tell you this. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is to reach for someone's hand in the dark and keep holding on when the sun rises. If their story moved you, or if you've ever carried a love through your own storms, let us know in the comments below. Your stories are the threads that bind us together. If you want to hear more tales of resilience, hope, and the power of human connection, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and tap the bell for new stories every week. Because in the end, We're all just searching for a hand to hold, morning after morning, no matter what the world calls it, and sometimes against all odds we find it.